Hi guys. I'm going to discuss our last programming challenge called Payroll so that we can go through this. Only a few of you have turned the assignment in. A couple of you have had questions, and so with the lack of turning assignments in, I'm not sure if we're not understanding it. I'm not sure if we started it. I don't know what's going on. So I'm going to assume that we're having a little bit of trouble with it. So I want to walk through the question. I want to make sure that you guys can read these questions and understand what it is the task is asking you to do. And then we're going to walk through my solution. We'll go through and look at what it is that I've done based upon the prompts given in the problem. So the first thing we need to do is to read the problem. We have to understand the problem so that we can uh, solve the challenge the way that it asks us to solve it. So let's start off by reading this. All right, it says, write a payroll class that uses the following array fields. So the first thing I did was write the payroll class. I did not jump into writing the main class because I don't even yet know what it is it wants me to do. So if it says write a payroll class, I'm going to start off with that payroll class first. Now it says that the payroll class has to have the following arrays as fields. Now they're telling you that these are arrays, and when they say as fields, we know that fields are also your instance variables. So the first array field that we need is the employee ID. So it says it's an array of 7 integers. So we're going to create an array of 7 integers called employee ID. And again, I'm giving you the names of these arrays, and you should be using these names that I give you in your programs. All right, so it says it's an array of 7 integers to hold the employee identification numbers. Now it goes on to say the array should be initialized with the following numbers. If it tells you in the challenge that it should be initialized with the following values, that means don't prompt the user to enter in values. Just go ahead when you create this array and fill in those values. Okay? The next array that is in your field is called hours. It is an array of 7 integers to hold the number of hours worked by each employee. The next array that you're going to create is called pay rate, and it will hold 7 doubles to hold each employee's hourly rate. The next array is called wages, and it will be an array that will hold 7 doubles to hold each employee's gross wages. Now notice in these last 3 arrays, it did not say to fill them with anything. So we're going to create them, just leave them sit there. Okay? Now let's keep reading. It says the class should relate the data in each array through subscripts. Now what that means is that the number in element 0 for the hours array should be the number of hours worked by the employee who has that identification number. Okay, so they have to match. So when you're talking about employee with identification number 5658845, that is a real person who worked real hours and who has a real wage, and they should match. If he is in subscript 0 of the ID array, then his hours should be in subscript 0, and his pay rate should be in subscript 0 of the other arrays. Okay? Now it says, in addition to the appropriate accessor and mutator methods. And I'm going to pause right there because it's telling you right there, in addition to. That means you need to create these accessor methods and mutator methods. Well, which accessor method? Which mutator method? Well, accessors and mutators are all based upon your instance variables. So if we have these as our instance variables, then I need setters and getters for each one of them. Then it goes on to say, it says, in addition to these accessor and mutator methods, the class should have a method that accepts an employee's identification number as an argument and returns the gross pay for that employee. Now that's all it says it should do. You're going to be bringing in an employee's identification number as a parameter. It's going to calculate the gross pay for that employee and return it. That is all that method is supposed to do. It's not supposed to do any printing. It's not going to display anything. It's only going to do whatever it says it's supposed to do. Now, after you create your payroll class, then we're going to demonstrate the class in a complete program. This will be your runner program. So we're going to stop right there. in the reading, we're going to go create the payroll class. I don't even need to know what's going on in the demo class or the runner program until I create the payroll class. So let me go to my replets. Let me go to my replets here. I already have my code in there. And let's take a look at it. All right. When you open up a generic REPL instead of in a class, this is what it looks like. And what's also nice, whenever you open a generic REPL that is outside of our class, you can invite people by clicking the share button to come in and work on the program at the same time that you're working on it. That's pretty cool. All right, anyways, let's go to the payroll class. We're going to walk through it. We're going to do these things, and I'm going to show you how I did these things one at a time. All right, now the first part of the directions says that you need to create an array that will hold the employee's ID. So I went ahead and I created private int. It's an integer array called employee ID, and I went ahead and initiated that array with the ID numbers that it told me to put in there. So I didn't have to prompt the user or anything. Now notice this right here. Instead of this saying private, I named it public. By putting it public, that allows it to be accessed from another class. Why would I ever want to do something like that? Well, if from another class I would need to know the number of employees, I will allow that class to come in and have access just only on this instance variable, not on the other ones. So you'll need to decide if you want to make it public or private. Very seldom will you make them public. Most of the time they'll be private, but in this instance I made it public. We could have also created another method later that would come up here and access this if we wanted to make this private. But because all this does is just tell us how many employees we have, there's really not any way that I can corrupt my class by making it public, so I did. All right, so I created a final int. Remember, that's called a named constant, so that's why all uppercase letters. And then I set it equal to 7. And you're going to see why I did this, because I'm going to use this variable later in my methods. All right, so I created the first array that it told me to. The next array, it said create an integer array called hours. Well, this is why I created this public field up here so that I could use it to set the size of this array. Now, one of you that turned in one of your programs was very creative, and instead of using this, you down here said new int, and what you passed right here was employee ID.length, which was beautiful. That was perfect. I really liked that. By passing in employee ID.length, it made this size declarator the same size as this. So that is just another way to do it, and I'm glad to see that you learned something there because it was really nice. All right, the directions also said create a double array called pay rate. Again, it all has to be the same size so that we can match up the subscripts. Remember, we read that in the directions. It says they all have to match up. Employee 1, their ID must match up at the same subscript for pay rate and for hours. So again, we created the third or the fourth array that it asked for called wages. And again, we made it the size of num employees. All right, so we created these. Now, not only did we declare them here, we also created them. They are 7 elements long. That's their length. And right now they have default values of zeros in there. Remember, when you create an array, and if you don't instantiate it from the beginning, like we did up here with these ID numbers, the default values that go in here are zeros. Okay. All right. The directions then started telling you that you need setters and getters. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that I don't have in this payroll class is an argument constructor. The reason I don't have an argument constructor is because in the employee ID array, I went ahead and filled it in myself. Remember, a constructor constructs, that's its job. But if you don't have any information coming in from the main runner program to build that array, well, then you don't need a constructor to do any constructing. So if you think back when we first did classes, we created classes that we didn't create any argument constructors. But remember, every class has a default constructor that if we didn't initiate them, they would automatically get zeros or an empty string. And that's exactly what's happening right here. Our argument constructor, or no argument constructor, is filling these three arrays with zeros. Alrighty, so we don't have an argument constructor. That's why you don't see it there. And the directions tell us to create setter methods and getter methods. So here we go. We can see that the first one I said, get gross pay. Well, I put it here. Remember, these methods can be in any order. I first of all put my get gross pay method at the top, and then I did my setters and my getters. It doesn't matter what order you have these in as long as you do them all. Now, you're going to see here in these methods that the bodies of these methods are all one-liners because I'm simply doing what the task, the challenge asked me to do. Now, in the get the gross pay method, it simply said, get the gross pay. Well, we need to know how to calculate gross pay. Gross pay is the hours worked times the pay rate. So if I need to get the gross pay, it has to be a value returning method that holds a double, and I have to be bringing in whoever I'm talking about. So if I'm bringing in some employee that is going to be referenced by some index I in my main program, I'm simply passing to this method whatever index I'm looking at. And when I calculate its gross wages, I'll simply return it back to the method that called it. So all I'm doing, one line, return hours index I times pay rate index I. And like I said, once we do the main program, you're going to see that all I need is to bring in the element of the array I'm talking about. If this would be subscript 0, I'd be talking about the first person that is stored in my array, my first employee. I would take first the hours for the first person and multiply it times the pay rate for the first person, and then simply return it. So that's all we needed for calculating the gross pay. Then I need to go and do all my setters and my getters. So remember at the top, let's scroll back up so we can see it. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 private instance variables or fields, whatever you want to call them. So I need setters and getters for each one of those. Because remember, if they're private and I need to go get one of them, I have to have a method that will get it. I need a method that will set it because outside of this class, you don't have access to private instance variables. So here we go, set employee ID at, and then what I need there is the element, which position is it in, which subscript, and then once I know the subscript, what ID number do you want in there? So this method, this setter method, has to tell the subscript and then give me the ID number that you want stored in there. And again, a one-liner. So employee ID, it matches the method name up at the top. Whichever index I'm talking about, that's this right here, they match. And then set it equal to the ID, whatever that is. One-liner, so it's a setter. Now we come down here to set hours at. Well, just like the set employee ID at, I need which index you want me to set and how many hours you want me to set. And then in the hours array at that index, I'll set it equal to the hours that you're sending in through the parameter. Let's continue with the setter methods. Now we're going to set the pay rate at. Well, just like all the other ones, I need to know which index you want and what pay rate you want. And then down here, I access my pay rate array at the index specified, and I set it equal to the amount specified. And let's see, now we're going to set the wages. It's our last array up there in our instance fields. So we set the wages. Again, I need an index value, and I need to know what the wages are. And then I go to the wages array at the specified index and set it equal to what the wages are for that person at that index. So that takes care of my setter methods. Now I need getter methods. And we're going to need these getters because when we call these things from the main method, you're going to see that they needed to be there. All right, so just like we had setter methods, I need getters. Well, if it's a getter, that means it's a value returning method, so I need its data type. If it says get employee ID and those are integers, well then I need to return an integer. Well, if this is a getter, it has a parameter saying which employee ID do you want me to get? You have to send it an index. And then what it will do, it will return and from the employee ID array, the ID number from whatever index you sent to it. And the next getter methods work the same way. If I want to get the hours, you need to tell me which index you want, and then I will return the hours at the specified index. The get pay rate, you have to specify which index you're talking about, and then you will return the pay rate at that specified index. And the last one, get the wages. You will return the wages at the specified index. Now remember what wages are. Your wages are what you're being paid per hour. And that's it. As you can see, the payroll class is very short, very simple, and the body of each one of these methods is one line. Very, very simple. Okay, now let's go look at the main method. Now I want to go back to the directions so that you can see what they ask you to do in the main method. So let me go back to the assignments in our class. Let's go down to the payroll class, edit the assignment, go in and look at it. All right, here we are back in the directions, the prompt. So we just wrote the payroll class. So now right here it says demonstrate the class in a complete program. And again, this is your main program. That displays, remember what it means to display. Display means a print statement. Okay, so whatever follows this word display, you need to make sure that it's being displayed by a print statement. It displays each employee number. Make sure you display the employee number and asks the user. So here we're going to be prompting the user to enter in that employee's hours and pay rate. So from the main method, you're going to be prompting the user's pay and hours worked. Not from the payroll class. It tells you to do it from the main program. So if we missed that and you're trying to ask the user for information from your payroll class, you didn't read the task correctly. You weren't careful in your reading. So after you ask for the employee's hours and the pay rate, it should then display each employee's identification number and gross wages. So what you're going to be doing, you're going to ask, first of all, and again, it'll be done through a loop, you're going to see in a moment, to enter in the employee's hours and the pay rate given the employee's identification number. Now, it says, note, the main class should not contain any of the methods mentioned at the top. So all these methods up here that we're talking about, all these instance variables and everything, all the methods, your setters and your getters and your calculate the wages, your main method shouldn't have any of those. That should all be done in payroll because the main method has its own stuff to do. So the only thing the main class should do is exactly what it says. And it says right here what it should do. So you needed to read that carefully to see what it needed to do. Okay. It needs to display the employee number and ask the user to enter hours and the pay rate. Then the main class will display the employee's ID number and its gross wages. Okay. And it can be achieved through simple calls to methods through print statements. Now, it says also here, don't accept any negative values for hours because you can't work a negative number of hours, and you can't, it doesn't want you to accept a pay rate less than $6. Okay, so that means that all of their employees are making at least $6 an hour. Now, nowhere in these directions does it say that you need to create other static methods within the main method. That defeats the whole purpose of you creating a class that has methods in it. If you're going to be creating static methods within a main method, why create a class? You can just put all of your methods in the main method. So don't create any static methods. All right, so let's go now and look at my solution for the main method. So let's go back to my REPLs. Let's see, go into payroll. And let's open up the main. Here we go. All right, now remember what it said the main is supposed to be doing. I need to prompt the user for some information, so the first thing I did was import my utility scanner. All right, so we're in the main method. Here's my main method header. Now I know from what was stated in the directions that I'm going to be prompting two pieces of information from the user, the hours and the pay rate. So I need a place to store them. If I'm going to ask the user to enter a piece of information in, I need some place to put it. So I declared two variables, one hours, one called pay rate. Then in line 16 here, I created myself um, my scanner object so that I can prompt the user and get that information. Now, in order to display information and in order to call anything from that payroll class that we already created, you have to create a payroll object. If you don't create a payroll object, then there is no way that you can access anything from the payroll class. You will get an error, something like it'll say variable or object or anything, whatever you're looking for, not found. And again, because you never created the object, so of course it can't find it. So line 19 is very, very important. If you want to access that payroll class, you better create a payroll object. And we're only creating one payroll object here because we only have one set of employees. If you had several different sets of employees, then you would have to create a payroll object for each one of them. Alrighty, now remember what the directions said. I need to get the hours and the pay rate for each employee. So think about it. How would you ask the user to enter in the hours and pay rate? Would you go through and ask for all of the hours worked by each employee first and then go back and ask for all of the pay rates for each one? Or would you ask for the pay rate for employee one and then ask for the hours worked at the same time? You have to decide which one makes more sense. Okay? So to do this, we don't want to have 7 different print statements for each employee for hours and wages. It defeats the whole purpose. Use a loop to help you do that. So here we go. I'm using a loop. I'm going to get the hours and the pay rate for each of my employees. Now, the reason we use a loop here is because if you have many, 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 many employees and you don't use a loop, you have a lot of code that you're going to be writing that is monotonous. That's the whole purpose of using a loop. You write the code for it once, and it can go through and get all the information that you need with one block of statements. All right, so here we go. For int I equals 0, I'm starting with the first person, the very first person in our arrays from the payroll class now. And I'm going to continue to do that until I get up through my array for my number of employees. Now notice right here it says when I is less than PR. I am accessing here the object that I just created because I need to go into my payroll class and say how big is the num employees. That is why in the payroll class I made num employees public. If I would have not made num employees public, this would be an error. I would not be able to access that information directly. Okay, that is why I made it public so that I could do this. This here holds the number 7 and it points to the object called PR because you have to tell it where to look first. Okay, all right, so we'll continue this loop as long as our test expression is true. What do you want to ask the user? Enter the hours worked by employee number. Well, which employee? I need to go in and get that employee's ID number so that the person giving me the information knows who I'm talking about. So I have to go, again, name your object, tell it where to look, PR dot, and I don't have direct access to the get employee ID because that's private. So I have to use the getter method to go in and get that ID number for me. So I tell it where to look, I call the correct method, and I pass to that method whatever index I'm on. Well, right now we're just now starting, so we're talking about index subscript 0, so that means the first person in my ID list. So this prompts the user to enter in the hours worked. The user will enter in the hours worked for the first employee based on his ID number. You can't say enter the hours worked by employee number 1 because then that person would come out and say to you, well, who's that? So without some type of identification, they don't know what hours to give you. Okay? Now, it's possible that in some business you don't give them ID numbers. Maybe you just simply use their name. So this would have been a string array that would hold names. But for this example, we have ID numbers, so you have to tell it which ID number you're talking about, or they won't know. So the user will enter in the ID or the hours worked by that employee with that ID number, and it will store it in hours. Okay. Well, the very next thing we have to do, don't forget what the directions said you have to validate that and make sure that the hours worked is not negative. So we use a while loop. Now remember, we're still inside the for loop. While hours is less than 0, that means if hours is less than 0, we've got a problem. And it'll print that and say error, enter 0 or greater for the hours. And then it's waiting for the input from the user again. And it will continue this loop over and over and over and over again until that user enters in a value for hours that is greater than or equal to 0. Once it enters in the correct hours worked, then it moves on and asks the user to enter in the pay rate for that given ID number. We're still on the subscript 0, which is the first employee of our list of employees. So I'm getting the hours and then the pay rate at the same time for each employee. I'm not going to go get all the hours and then go back and get all the pay rates. I'm doing it all at one time. And just like we went and got the hours, I'm going to get the pay rate. I have to tell it where to look. I have to call the employee's ID number at the given index. We're still on the first employee, so that's a 0. And then I have to get, let me open this up here. It's cutting off my stuff. Okay. Get the hourly rate, okay, for employee, and then there's the rest of it right there. And it's going to store that in pay rate. Well, again, the direction said if the pay rate is not at least $6, we have a problem. So again, I need another while loop. I need to say pay rate less than $6. If the pay rate is less than $6, you got to give the user an error and tell him to enter it again, $6 or greater, and then store it again. And again, this loop will happen over and over and over again until the user enters in a pay rate that is at least $6. Okay? Then we didn't store it yet. We didn't put it in the array. All we did was get the first pay hours worked and the first pay rate for the first employee with a given ID number. Now I have to send that information to the array in the payroll class. Now remember, I don't have direct access to those arrays because they're private, so I have to call the necessary setter methods to set it for me. So again, I have to call the object, whichever our object is. And remember, when we created that payroll object above, we called it PR, dot set hours. And if you remember what the parameter list was in the payroll class that we said we needed an index number, and then we needed the hours worked. So it calls this method, and what it does, it sets the hours for the first person in the hours array. Just like the hours, now I have to set the pay rate that the user entered. Again, object name, tell it where to look, call the set pay rate method, tell it which index to store it at, and send it the pay rate. And right here is the end of that for loop. So we don't want to end the for loop until we go back up, check our test expression. We increment this. This now increments our I to a 1. Is 1 still less than 7? Remember we said this is 7. That is true. So we continue to go through this entire for loop again, asking the same questions, doing the same validations for the next employee in the list, which is that subscript 1. And it will continue this process until this test expression is no longer true, which in our case will be once the last employee's information has been received. All right, so that brings us down to line 55 now. So we have filled the hours array, we have filled the pay rate array, and now we're ready to calculate the employee's wages. Okay, so I gave it a couple little titles and headers in my table that you'll see nicely when we go and run this program. So I printed out some stuff just so we could have some labels. Now, I don't want to print, and I saw on a couple of your work that you used a print statement for everything you wanted to print. So if there were 7 employees and you needed to print their wages, you printed at least seven different print statements for to get the employees information. And it's not necessary. Imagine if you had 50 or 100 employees, you'd be sitting here writing code for 100 employees. Instead, you need to use a loop so that you only have to write the code once and let the loop do the work. So here we go. We're getting ready to display all of our data. All right, so again, for int I equals 0, as long as I is less than, okay, again, tell it where to look. We're still working on the same object, PR, and again, this is a 7. So we're going to continue to do this as long until it's not true anymore, but what it's going to do is display all of our information for our 7 employees. The first thing we're going to do is print employee ID number. The directions said make sure you print the employee ID number. It didn't say to print employee number 1. It wants the employee's ID. So employee ID, well, I've got to go get it. I have to tell it where to look. I have to call the appropriate method called getEmployeeAt and tell us what index I want printed. Well, I'm starting at 0, so this here passes a 0 into that method, and it's going to go in and print the first ID number in our ID array. Then I said gross pay. Now again, I formatted my output. Some of you did not format your output. You really need to go back and do that. Gross pay, well now I'm calling the gross pay method. I told it where to look, which object I'm working with, and I called the gross pay method on the given index. So right now I'm talking about employee number 1. And if you think back to the payroll method or payroll class, the get gross pay method had one line in it, and it was simply to return the hours worked times the rate of pay, and that gives you your gross pay. And it will do this for all 7 employees until this expression is no longer true. All right, so let's run my program. I want you to see how mine runs. Now remember, before I run this, there are several different ways you can write this program. One of you wrote it very, very similar to what I just showed you. Another one wrote a successful program. It was completely different. I mean, it probably almost couldn't have been more different than what you see here, but it still completed the task. All right, so let's run this. Alrighty, hopefully I have no errors. I don't think I do. All right, it says enter the hours worked by employee number whatever. So notice here, it's not saying by employee number 1, because if I were using this and I entered all the data in, I'd be like, well, who's employee number 1? So I would either need a person's name here or I would need the person's ID number. So I'll enter in the hours worked. I'm just going to make this up. Let's say they worked hours. And also that same person's hourly pay rate, they make $15 an hour. So I'm not going to keep reading all this. I'll just throw a bunch of information in for you. All right, so hours worked, $5 an hour, 40 hours, $20 an hour. Let's see, hours worked, 35, $12 an hour, 2 hours, $15 an hour, 40 hours, $15 an hour, 3 hours, $12 an hour. And then once I entered in all that information, my display statements right here, you see these statements right here. Once I got out of this for loop to enter in all the pay rate and the hours worked, then these statements took over and it gives me this output right here. Okay, my payroll data, it says employee ID and it gives me that employee's gross wages. Then it goes to the next employee and gives me his gross wages, and so on for all 7 employees. All right, so that sounded like a very, very quick review, even though we're up to 34 minutes in this video. Please go back and watch it again. Okay, if there was any part of this that you didn't understand, please go watch it again. It's important that you understand what we've done here and why we've done it. Again, your program doesn't have to look just like mine, but it should look similar to mine. It's important that you are able to read the programming challenges, the actual problems themselves, the task, so that you can understand what it is that it's asking you to do. Because if you don't understand the reading, it's really difficult to write the solution when you don't even understand the problem. So always make sure that you read the problem carefully, understand what it's asking you to do, and then start by writing usually your classes first. Usually I don't write the runner program until after my classes are written. And I think that that might be part of the problem that some of you are having. I think you're trying to write the runner program first. Don't know, I'm just guessing there. But write your classes first and keep them simple. Your methods in your classes should never have print statements in them unless there's directions that specifically says write a print statement in them or display something. Usually that is done in your main method, your runner program. All right, if you have any questions, please ask for help. I would like those of you that didn't turn this in yet to get it turned in. And that doesn't mean to just copy everything that I have. I would like you to take what you see here, make it work in your program, and submit your response. All right, good luck.